The first minute or two, the sound is a little raw, but it gets cleared up real fast. So don't worry about the initial sound quality. John Steele on memory, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Okay, we have ignition. This morning, we're going to explore a vast array of stuff which has come to me over the years through various channels with no names. And I'm really going to speak my mind. I'm going to think it out, so it's not in any set form, but there is an order I want to go through. And it will be kind of a look at different elements of contracted mind and extended mind, so we can begin to see the juxtaposition of the two, how each one defines the other. The element of contracted mind I'd like to look at first before the extended mind aspect. And for those of you who heard me last year, I'll briefly capitulate this idea of the Kali Yuga as a set piece before I launch into the specifics. The Kali Yuga is the age that we live in terms of East Indian chronology. There are 4 great yugas of time. There is, roughly speaking, a golden age, a Sat Yuga, and then a silver age, and then a bronze age, and then an iron age, each one of varying durations. We won't get into the cosmological mathematics because they're up for grabs. Allegedly, the age that we live in now is the end of a cycle. Each of these 4 ages is part of a cycle called a Maha Yuga. The Kali Yuga is the dark age, it's the iron age, it's the age of Kali. Kali is a goddess of dissolution of time and structures. She clears the way for those impediments of evolution that have arisen. Now, in the Kali Yuga, what occurs is, in terms of time, very interesting, because the Tibetan translation for Kali Yuga literally means the dregs of time. The dregs of time, what does that mean? It means the bottom of the barrel of time. It means that time has reached a density, a certain temporal density, and this temporal density can actually be felt somatically in the body. Now, what is the definition of temporal density? Temporal density means we have too many events per unit of time to fully assimilate in our everyday life. That means that you've got to pay the bills and take the kids out and go to the doctor and wash the clothes and put out the cat and, do everything. It's an unending array of tasks that have to be accomplished. And just when you think you've finished them all, new ones magically arise. You are never finished. Now, so the Kali Yuga has this idea of a temporal density, and I want to explore that in several different ways here. One of the things that occurs in the Kali Yuga, one other aspect, which is an interesting concomitant to the temporal density, is that there is a seasonal disequilibrium. In other words, the climate and the seasons go out of whack. Rain doesn't fall at the right time. Snow doesn't fall at the right time. There's a seasonal imbalance. This is one of the aspects in terms of the Kali Yuga, this climatic disequilibrium. And what I'm pointing to is when you get a temporal high temporal density, there is at least a correspondence to a climatic fluctuation. And as people like Padmasambhava and other great teachers have said, this climatic disequilibrium is part of the Kali Yuga. Now, one of the aspects in terms of, again, of Eastern thought that occurs in the Kali Yuga is how shall we say, our time window narrows in this kind of density scenario. And so what happens, last night the Miller Lite beer ad was mentioned. I will mention another beer ad which may bring back some memories. Quite a few years ago in America there was a Schlitz ad, Schlitz beer of Milwaukee, and it showed these macho guys on the sailboat and the spray coming out, and it said, "You only go around once in life, so grab all the gusto you can." So the idea was, since, this was it, you had to have as good a time as possible right now. So the idea encapsulated in this ad are many different values. First of all is the idea that there are no past lives and there are no future lives. This is it. And therefore, you've got to hedonistically explode in the moment and just really grab everything possible. Now, the value inherent here is that you'll go for short-term games and to hell with anything possible long-term. So this means rip off anyone, have war, as long as you profit in the immediate moment. Grab all the gusto you can. Now, back to Buddhism for a moment. In the one of the sutras, the La Kavantara Sutra, one of the Buddhist sutras, there is a wonderful teaching, and this is not Tantric Buddhism, it's Mahayana Buddhism, but it's still the same basic set. And one of the teachings in there goes as such. For those of you who, my work is on memory, so I have this great interest in the subject. It says, when the triple world is surveyed, that's past, present, future, by the bodhisattva, he perceives that its existence is due to memory that has been accumulated since the beginningless past, but wrongly interpreted. Now, it is this concept of memory that is wrongly interpreted that I want to take a good hard look at here. And before we get into that, a few more notes here. The word memory in Sanskrit comes from the word vasana, V-A-S-A-N-A, and it's a beautiful word because it has several different nuances. It means a memory which is transmitted from one life to another, either consciously or unconsciously, usually unconsciously. Memories, habit patterns that are generated within one life are called samskaras. That's different from a vasana. Vasanas have a cross-life connection. Now, one of the secondary meanings of this word vasana is very appropriate to one of my other interests, and that is fragrance. Because the secondary meaning of the word vasana means if you have an empty perfume bottle, even if it's completely empty, the smell always remains of that scent in that bottle. In other words, the scent pervades even when the vessel is empty. And this is what in the Sanskrit language, very mixture of great technical precision and great poetic insight. You have this idea that a past life memory is like, it's like the smell which goes through time. The smell memory goes from one life to another, even though the bottle is empty. Now, in this word also means habit energy. Vasana means habit energy. And this word habit energy in Tibetan, bakchak is the term for it. It's like a trace, like the smell, like the trace. And the teaching in the sutra is that these traces, they build up after a while to the extent where we begin to nucleate an ego around them, like I get up every morning and I do this and I eat that, and you get this whole kind of an axis of a moment, what the Buddhists call an axis of the moment begins to generate. This I, the subject, begins to generate from habitual action, repetitive, automatic, hypnotic, action. Now, therefore, one of the strategies to deal with this nucleation around this moment of subjectivity is to learn how to, shall we say, die to oneself. And this is in the perennial philosophy and the mystical philosophies known as the tradition of unknowing, like the 14th century English mystic work, The Cloud of Unknowing. And this whole process I want to look at in a moment. I just wanted to set that out. Now, with the idea of memory wrongly interpreted, we can begin to look at a bit of present time through this filter. You see, we live in an age at which we are virtually hoarding memory. Computers are based on the idea, like you look at women in terms of their vital measurements, where you look at computers in terms of their vital measurements, in terms of their memory capacities. This one has so many bits, and this one has more bits, and this one can process those bits faster and faster. The memorial capacity is really the key to the strength of a computer. Now, the trouble is with this is that there is, and I'm generalizing, much of what computers do is wonderful. I'm not putting down computers per se. But there is an emphasis on the acquisition of memories that can be stuck into the computer. And what too many memories do after a while, whether they are in a... See, because if they're in a computer, even if they're in a computer, they have to be in a programmer's mind, even in a real chunked style. There has to be some level of recursiveness even in the programmer's mind. Now, how much he offloads into the computer itself, there has to be some level of memory of what's inside. So the more that's inside the computer, the more that has to be in the mind of the programmer. It's a great reduction, but still, you begin to set up a great array of memories that is auxiliary to what would be needed for ordinary life. Now, what begins to happen is that with this tremendous array of memory storage, and you begin to clog a system. A system becomes constipated by actual too much hoarding of memory. Now, this hoarding of memory sets up a kind of a psychological density. And as a system becomes clogged, it becomes brittle. That is to say, it cannot react quickly to crisis situations because it is overloaded with choices and information. There's too much information. Every time that something happens now in the modern world, the reaction time is stunted to such a point by the vast array of information processing technology that people cannot react like that anymore in real critical decisions. Everything is so rationally displayed in terms of its memorial capacity. And yet, with all this memorial capacity and all this incredible telecommunications, the world is coming apart at the seams. I mean, we're balanced on, as the Tibetans say, we're licking honey from the razor's edge in terms of our information acquisition. It's actually, and this is memory wrongly interpreted, this vast collection of memory as though more is better. That's the assumption that we're working under. Now, the more memory that you accrete, you see, paradoxically, you set yourself up more for what in systems terms we call the likelihood of a runaway system. A runaway system is like a snowball going down a hill, getting bigger and bigger and more progressively out of control. And the more you develop memory wrongly interpreted in terms of vast acquisition, the more likely you are to go into a runaway system. Because your reaction time is cut. Your direct perception, your direct, unmediated by vast information technology is cut. And this likelihood of a runaway system occurs. And this is what happens, you see, in things like all this conjugate stuff. You have this incredible information technology. You have the NSC computers and the CIA computers and the DIA computers and all these things. And what happens is that you lose control of who's in charge. It's Ollie North is running the ball this way, and Colby's running the ball this way, and everyone's kind of what we call in systems theories again. You begin to generate institutions within institutions. And this happens when you get this memory wrongly interpreted to such a point where clarity disappears of the overview. Now, what further begins to happen is that this memory wrongly interpreted begins to generate... This is a footnote. There are two types of unconscious mind I want to point out here. One is what I would call unconscious. And that's when you're asleep at the wheel. It's like you're dead drunk. It's like you're numbed. There's no sensation. Okay, that's unconscious, unconscious. Then, contrasted to that, there's conscious, unconscious. Now, the link of conscious, unconscious is really shamanic consciousness. It's where there is a bridge between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. It's what Jung would call the transcendent function. There's a bridge between these two realms. Now, most people are walking around, as all the perennial philosophies say, we're in a state of sleep. We're walking around in a state of unconscious, unconscious. It's what Gurdjieff calls we're all asleep. We're sleepwalkers. This unconscious, what happens then is this, there's an unconscious mental mass is generated by memory wrongly interpreted. In other words, what begins to happen is, conversely to what Terence was talking about last night, the idea of a living conscious memory, what gets generated is what William Burroughs would call language as virus is generated. You see, this is where language goes out of control. It's just the opposite to a living language. And what I call an unconscious mental mass proliferates in the environment. And it means that there's all these kind of invisible habit patterns and invisible kind of runaway systems linguistically on a subvocal voice in the environment. And as one of my teachers has said, that at a certain point, habit patterns become solidified in the environment and in the body. Now, this is something that, and this is from the Tibetan point of view, this is something actually that Norbu said, that habit patterns get solidified, and the great illustration of this in terms of, for example, tantric thought, is there's a great Indian Mahasiddha, Saraha, who was the arrow maker, and he taught the idea that memory, it can exist in many states. It's like water. Water can be very fluid, and that at a certain point it can become ice and become solidified. Now, that's the shift from natural mind and natural memory to memory wrongly interpreted when it solidifies. And when it solidifies, the mind stops. It gels like that. And that's where this sensation of ego comes from, this nucleation. So this idea of an unconscious mental mass as the idea of language as virus is something that we kind of have to be aware of. It's the idea that words have a life of their own. It's like people's minds, the subvocal voice. Oftentimes you think, well, I'm in charge, and the subvocal voice is going, I want this, I want this, I want this, what the Buddhists call monkey mind. It's like it's going here and here and here, and you are saying, oh, I don't really think that, but something else, and that's this automatic mind is going off, and that's this language as virus, memory wrongly interpreted, gone organic. Now, one of the aspects of why that there's this great accumulation of memory is it's the idea, the illusion is that the more memory we have, the more control and manipulation and prediction of reality we will have. If we can manage memory and keep it, on tap, so we can push a button, therefore we'll be able to manipulate reality better with all this memory that we've got there and the external forms of computer banks and books and everything else. And we begin to hoard memory because we feel it will give us prediction and control and manipulation of reality. The Central Intelligence Agency, stop and think of that for a moment. Central Intelligence Agency, what does it do? It gathers information about everything in the world except the natural intelligence of the people who are in the organization. There's nothing to do with self-knowledge. Intelligence of the other, not of self-knowledge. Now, the idea of this memory wrongly interpreted brings us to an interesting model here. Again, in the Buddhist framework, we talk about that thought or memory, as the teaching goes, as Saraha teaches in his what he calls the royal song, the Dohas. And these are kind of like poetic teachings. He teaches that memory arises from emptiness, abides in emptiness, and then dissolves back into emptiness. Or, as he teaches, memory arises from non-memory, what he calls non-memory, abides in non-memory, and then sinks back, dissolves into non-memory. Now, this cycle of arising, abiding, and dissolving is the cycle of all thought. And this cycle is also two other analogs that we can give to it. It is the basic nature of today what Prigogine calls dissipative systems. Things arise, they abide, and they dissolve. And they arise in a slightly different form, and then they abide in a slightly different form, and they dissolve. Now, dissipative systems, a footnote on this, is much more ancient than Prigogine. What all he's done is brought it into a contemporary mode. In the early forms of my interest of archaeology, we find it embodied in the idea of the triple goddess. That is to say, the triple goddess is exemplified by the three phases of the moon. And that is to say, there's a new moon, there's a full moon, and then there's the waning moon. And then they go back to a fourth phase, which people rarely really recognize, and that is the state where the moon is not visible at all. That is really the true emptiness. And this dissipative cycle is mirrored in the arising of thought, abiding of thought, and dissolving back into. Now, the reason I bring this up is the following, is that in the paradigm of memory, as it's looked at in the 20th century, memory is looked at primarily from the point of view of Western psychology only in one of these three phases. That is to say, it's looked at principally in the middle phase, the abiding phase. We do not look at where memory comes from or where it goes to. Only in a psychoanalytical sense. We look at your childhood memories and stuff like that. But we do not really consider the idea of emptiness or of non-memory as an origin point. We look at this kind of psychoanalytic history as our way, but not as real emptiness. So we have a focus only on one phase, the abiding phase. That is the phase of how do memories operate in the ordinary, everyday, visible world. How do we operate in that form? And this is where memory, wrongly interpreted, generates itself and proliferates, right in this gap of only looking at the middle phase of the dissipative cycle. Because you neglect the arising and dissolving, you begin to get an overbalance, and that's why it gets brittle. That's why it gets constipated, because the cycle is looked at in only one part of it. Okay, now the next thing that I would like to look at is the idea that one of the characteristics of the Kali Yuga, another one besides this temporal density, is the whole concept, and this is something I've been developing from my doctoral thesis for years, but it progressively comes into more focus, is the idea of object proliferation. Object proliferation. Now, let me give you a brief history of objects to put you in the picture. The first man-made objects that we have are 3 million years old. These first objects are found in Africa, and they are very small. They are like hand axes and pounding tools and things like that, with a minimal of modification to them, very minimally modified. And as an archaeologist, I happen to study this in great detail, the kind of generation of tool making. And what progressively begins to happen after another 1.5 million years of no new and improved models. Can you imagine, any the car industry with the same models for 1.5 million years. What begins to happen, the first innovation is symmetry. That's the first innovation in tool making, is the idea of some degree of symmetry. And then you begin to get into chipping and flaking as sharpening, and gradually you finally get into what we call microgeometry tools. You get into very, very small tools that are very precise and the kind of needlepoint stuff and very, very finely made things about 30,000, 40,000 years ago. And it's about 30 or 40,000 years ago, again, where you begin to generate the first symbolic objects. That's where you go from functional to symbolic objects. And when you make this leap, language is, afoot, as soon as you begin to get symbolic objects. And with symbolic objects and language, everything begins to escalate, because in the scenario of objects, as it were, what begins to happen is roughly we have the Neolithic Revolution, which is about 9,000, 10,000 BC. Some people put it a few thousand years earlier or later, but it's irrelevant. In the Neolithic Revolution, essentially, before we were hunter-gatherers, we were nomads. We followed herds of different animals, the caribou and the deer and the bison and the mammoth. We followed the seasonal growth of plants to wherever they occurred. We followed nature, and we did not own nature. Now, what gradually began to happen in the Neolithic Revolution, someone had a bright idea, and that is that we could domesticate crops and animals. We did not have to follow. We could take something and plant it. And with this planting, we could stay in one place. We would not be at the kind of whims of this grand seasonal variation. And our animals, we could domesticate animals. That is to say, we did not have to go hunting all the time. We would begin to domesticate cows and keep them in pens, and sheep and goats and things like that would begin to occur. And, it's a wonderful invention for many people, the idea of stopping this nomadic life. Others were not so sure that this was a great idea, because there was a great virtue in the nomadic life in many ways as well. But history rolled on, and what began to happen is, as you begin to settle and to nucleate, you began to generate objects for the first time in a different scale than just hand axes and cutting tools, just the bare essential tools. You began to make tools, more permanent holding tools now. Instead of transporting water in ostrich eggs that were biodegradable in a very neat sense, you would begin to make longer lasting objects of clays and potteries. And in other words, the half-life of your objects would begin to increase. The idea of permanent objects instead of kind of a throwaway culture began to accrete. And as these objects began to accrete, you began to gradually through the years to make decorations on them and art on the objects. And this made the objects more valuable, quote unquote, whatever that meant at the time. And these objects had the very strange effect on people's minds as they acted like an attractor matrix for the human mind on which to see even further possibilities for the proliferation of even more objects. That is to say, once you made a bowl, well, we could make a better bowl, and a bowl with a spout, and then a bowl with a this on it, and one with greater capacity, and then so on and so forth. Object proliferation began to form. It began to be a mirror to which the mind could say, well, we've done this, but we can do this better. Before you extracted from nature, now you were on this kind of reflection process. So that was one dynamic that began to occur, object proliferation and the generation of even more objects. Now, I should say at a footnote right now, before I go on with the scenario, the average home has in it today 300,000 objects in it. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. And that means that you have to deal with the location and function and care of all these objects. So therefore, a lot of your mental activity is tied into this object array environment. Okay? Now, what happens, let's go back to the Neolithic for a moment. You see, then we have very few objects. It's gone from a few pots and bowls and a few digging sticks and spears and what have you, and furs and beads and things like that, to 300,000. I mean, the proliferation that has to go with that. You see, the concomitant proliferation is the secret of this process. Is when you begin to generate objects, you have to have a concomitant and corresponding memory for every object that you own, whether it's online or not. It is. The point is that we don't keep the 300,000 memory online all the time. It's we chunk things. We say it's in the garage, it's in the bedroom, it's in the den, it's in the kitchen. We have a chunking by spatial kind of labeling. But on the whole, what happens is, as soon as you have an object, you have to have a memory of that object. Otherwise, the object is useless to you. You don't know where you put it, and therefore you can't use it. So you have to have some corresponding memory. Now, in terms of ownership, what begins to happen is very interesting. As soon as you begin to have this object proliferation, you begin to have the generation of a noun. A linguistic noun has to come into being for the generation of that object. This is a spear thrower. This is, my water bowl. This is my fur to keep me warm. This is my talisman. Whatever it is, you have to have a corresponding noun for every object that is generated. Now, with this kind of generation of noun, the converse of this, the most curious thing begins to happen is the generation of pronouns. N begins to occur. This is my object. This is your object. This is his object. This is their object. When you were in nature, there was no pronouns. There was just this vast, undifferentiated participation mystique. No differentiation of subject and object. Therefore, no pronoun. So pronouns are generated from nouns, and nouns are generated from objects. So you get this linguistic matrix beginning to occur. And it occurs in this kind of unconscious proliferation. Again, language is virus. Now, what begins to happen is, again, the possibility of runaway systems. And as Morris Berman, a cultural historian, pointed out recently, you begin to get what he calls commodity fetishism. The idea that in the old days, when objects, for example, certain totemic things in the Indian Northwest were made, they were meant to degenerate with weather after they were made. The masks and the things like that were left to weather and disintegrate, to dissolve in the dissipative cycle back into nature. They arise, they abided, and they dissolve. They were not kept as objects of art. You see, what we have done is taken these objects and got into the abiding phase, memory wrongly interpreted, and we fixate there. And we keep that going. So you get this very kind of interesting scenario arising. Now, let's take a look at this in terms of the media, how this can be put to us in a very entertaining and insightful way. There was a film that was made, I don't know, maybe 7-8 years ago. Something, I don't know, maybe it was more than that, 10 years ago, called The Gods Must Be Crazy. How many of you saw this film? I figured a lot of you would. I'll give you a brief recapitulation of this film because it's a wonderful teaching film. Basically, the scenario happens, there's an airplane flying over Africa, and two of the guys in it, one of them is drinking Coca-Cola, and he finishes the bottle, and he throws it out of the plane. They're over the middle of nowhere. He throws it out, and it lands near a Bushman hunting party, as chance would have it. And the Bushmen then see this bottle, and it is the introduction of a new and novel object into the culture. When this object comes in, first it is met with wonder and awe, and the multifarious uses of it are then discovered. First of all, you could put things in it as a container that was very durable. It was a wonderful container for water. Second of all, you could roll things out like a roller. Then you could blow in it and make wonderful sounds with it. Then you could, all these objects were all these uses for the object were seen. But what began to happen is that everyone wanted to use it. All the pronoun thing began to arise as soon as this object was introduced. And what began to happen in this little world where there was peace and harmony was discord. Tremendous sense of discord. I want it, no. And fights began to break out over who was going to use this Coca-Cola bottle. Exactly. This Coca-Cola had occurred. So the thought was, and this is brilliant, the Bushman wisdom still prevailed. They thought, the gods must be crazy to have given us this object. It causes havoc in this society. So one of them was given the task to take this Coca-Cola bottle to the edge of the world and get rid of it. Get this object out of here. We got enough objects. That's essentially what they were saying. Okay, so in a microcosm in this film is this wonderful teaching about how an object, a single object in this case, can take a very harmonically based culture and throw it out the window. Jung said, speaking of our current era, knowledge of the internal world of the psyche was eclipsed by the external world of objects. The very same insight. The more we got hooked on objects, the more that we began to lose the kind of internal world. Now, it's interesting that in terms of the very first writing ever discovered, is a favorite kind of point that's come up archaeologically, is not some mystical writing about Mu or Lemuria or channeling or anything like that. The first writing ever discovered is a Sumerian tax receipt. Okay? It's 4500 BC, and it's a tax receipt. Because what it is saying is, you have dealt with these objects, and we want to keep a record of them so that we can find out what as it were, the karmic trajectory of this object. Now, this is what begins to happen with objects. Record keeping grows as an industry. You have to keep a memory for every object. Record keeping grows in proportion to object proliferation. Today, the biggest industry on the face of the earth is record keeping. That's what computers do more than anything else, besides their creative uses. They do more than anything else is inventory. It's record keeping. And they're doing it, they're keeping track of objects and events connected with objects. The transactions and interactions and transformations of objects. That's what is being kept records of. So record keeping grows out of this proliferation of this object array. So in a sense, you see, you get an extended mind, an unconscious extended mind is generated through this generation of objects. And what it begins to generate then is the idea of, shall we say, a left brain memory. Now, a left brain memory, you see, corresponds to the middle phase of the dissipative cycle. That is to say, the abiding phase of memory. Memory in the world that we can see. And this, again, is the realm where, if you overload it, memory wrongly interpreted begins to proliferate. Now, let's take a closer look at this idea of the kind of the metaphysical arising of the way that we see the world. The density of objects in an environment creates a corresponding density of memory through record keeping. And in turn, this density of memory generates the density of time. Temporal density is a function of memorial density, and memorial density is a function of object density. You will notice that those cultures that have the fewest objects live in the dream time. You look at the Australian Aborigines with their minimal object array, and you see that they live in a completely different time frame. They live in a dream time. The Bushmen, the same. As your object density, memorial density, temporal density occurs, it sets out this extended unconscious array of time. Time is generated. And this generation of time, the density of time, has a further aspect to it, which is very interesting. Because of the transactions and accounting for all these objects, the emphasis is placed on short-term memory, because there are more objects and more transactions and interactions. Therefore, the short-term memory, where did I put this and what did I do with this and what happened here, because there are more things, your short-term memory has to be more active. And your short-term memory has to be more active also in terms of crisis situations. Whenever you have a potential crisis going on, which is now pretty much non-stop in the world at large. So the short-term memory has to keep track of everything. And again, the short-term memory takes place in this middle phase. Your short-term memory has to be more active also in terms of crisis situations. Whenever you have a potential crisis going on, which is now pretty much non-stop in the world at large. So the short-term memory has to keep track of everything. And again, the short-term memory takes place in this middle phase of memory abiding, in this middle phase. And this means that memory arising and memory dissolving. This is right brain memory. This gets left out. And this means that far memory, memory of past lives, that's where the Schlitzadz comes in. You only go around once in life. Well, that's smack in the abiding phase of the dissipative cycle again, you see. If object proliferation, short-term memory in terms of, I've looked at memory, I've read so much material on memory for the past 10 years on the experimental psychology aspects of memory, just to see what's in these people's minds. They're looking at smaller and smaller increments of memory. Short-term memory is like really where it's at for many people. Short-term memory is like a paradigm in itself. It's like corresponding to the search for the atom as the lowest common denominator in the physical world. Short-term memory is the lowest common denominator in the memorial world. You look for the accuracy and the way that short-term memory works as a kind of hypothesis that contributes to reality. Now, I should say as a footnote to that, the idea of what is known in the memory trade as STML, short-term memory loss, which is one of the signal attributes of altered states. This is one of the first things that happens to memory is short-term memory loss. Now, many people in the investigation of memory look at the real traditionalists in memory research look at short-term memory loss as pathological. You lose your mind. You're losing your mind if you lose your short-term memory. Watch out. Keep control. Stay in the abiding phase where it's safe. Let's accumulate some. Let's stay in control. It's all that kind of thing. Don't let go. Whatever you do, don't let go of your memory or you will just melt. You'll evaporate. But the real secret is that's the ploy. Stay with memory because memory is control. The point, that's how the CIA looks at it, and all intelligence agencies, they look at memory as control. But the secret is of the perennial philosophies that if you die to yourself, that if you learn the art of unknowing, that if you learn the art in Tibetan, which is called Tramme, which is non-memory, what happens then is that you do not lose your mind. Actually, you come into what Jill was talking about yesterday, primordial mind or nature of mind. This has no pronouns, you see. This has no hooks of personality to it. So memory is used as a control device. That's why when you take classes at school, you're asked to regurgitate in early school, wrote mnemonic. Because, see, this is a way of hooking you into control and predictability. It's kind of, give me back what I gave you now. Give that right back. No, nothing new. Just give that right back to me. You will get the highest marks on your test for regurgitation. So the idea of short-term memory loss as a gateway, it is actually a gateway into a different dimension, the dimension of God, the dimension of the overmind, of the overself, whatever you want to call it, Atman, Brahman. It doesn't matter. It's different spelling for the same phenomena. The same phenomena is primordial mind. It really doesn't matter what you call it. But if you control short-term memory as a kind of a sphincter and you don't let anyone through that or yourself through it, you're locked in this abiding phase. When you go through the rabbit hole, as it were, of short-term memory, through short-term memory loss, but you've got to go through it with awareness. If you go through it unconscious, you're finished. I mean, you're drunk, you're stoned, you can kill yourself in that form. You have no awareness, you have no clarity. But if you go through with awareness or clarity, that is the entrance to, as I say, the two phases of the dissipative cycle that are neglected, the arising and the dissolving aspects. You begin to see the entire dissipative nature of the mind. Now, one other thing about the objects here is that if you stay on the object level, you see, objects fixate attention. They fixate attention. And they generate kind of reactive automatic mind, that is, memory wrongly interpreted. So you fixate or you crystallize attention through your objects. This is my Mercedes, and I'm going to put an alarm system on it. No one's going to get this, and people begin to build up a paranoia about their valuable objects. You see, they become object hooked in that sense. Another aspect of this in terms of our particular time is that people tend to get into hoarding this time, in this age that we live. These 300,000 objects, we have become temporal pack rats, in a sense. We are hoarding all these objects in a sense. We don't need all these objects, all these 300,000 objects. We hoard them, and one of the reasons that we hoard them from a psychoanalytic point of view is that we think that these will be a buffer between us and death, between us and extinction. That if we hoard things, that they are a substitute for living time, these objects. And compulsive hoarding, and also a lot of people hoard when they get older, actually is a representative of trying to stave off death. The people who are very rich often accumulate tremendous arrays of things, not just for pleasure, but to actually keep the idea of extinction at bay. Now, if we look at objects from another point of view, that is to say, from the one point is, shall we say, the participation, the mystical participation, that is to say, when there's no difference between subject and object. In primitive societies, participation mystique, versus the idea of the Buddhist or Tantric teachings of detachment from objects. And I want to go into that for a moment. We have a very interesting kind of what Ken Wilber calls the pre-trans fallacy. You begin to separate two things which look the same, but they're really not. In the participation mystique, there's a kind of fusion of subject and object. In the Zen tradition, in the Eastern kind of sense, you are taught to detach yourself from objects, not buying their whole, seeing them as they are, but not becoming totally involved with them. And there's a subtle difference in this. As Hui Neng, the sixth patriarch, Zen patriarch, said, not to be defiled by external objects. This is to be one with the unconscious, and that's capital U. It's conscious, unconscious, he means there. That is to be detached from objects so they are present in consciousness. When all thoughts are discarded, consciousness is cleared off from all its defilements. So on one hand you have this fusion of subject and object, and the other one you have detachment like this. not getting attached to objects. Okay? Now, there are some similarities between these two states. In the participation mystique, you may not become attached, but you don't consciously become detached. There's a subtle difference. Now, if we go on with this a little bit, it becomes interesting, because what Jung refers to as this, or in the Zen tradition, this epistemological detachment. The translation for it of Hui Meng, of this unconscious, is the word Wu Nian. And Wu means no, and Nian means literally, it has several nuances to it. It means no memory or no habit patterns. It's most traditionally translated as no memory. So Wu Nian means no memory. Now, in other words, unconscious with a capital U, or unconscious or conscious unconscious, means a state of no memory. But what this no memory is, and it's very important, is that it is a temporary suspension. It is not an obliteration of memory, non-memory. Non-memory is what Longchenpa, one of the great masters of Tibetan Vajrayana thought, said the spontaneous wizardry of the mind takes place out of emptiness or out of non-memory, the spontaneous wizardry. And again, the obvious, by the very terms that he uses, akin to shamanism, right there with the term wizardry. Non-memory is something that, you see, a computer is very interesting. A computer cannot unknow. This is a very important thing. It cannot go into the unknowing mode. If you clear a computer's memory, it's no temporary suspension. That's it. The little I know about computers, if you wipe the disk clean, that's it. You don't just say, okay, forget this, and then see what happens. This is a uniquely human function, the ability to suspend and then see what happens. Now, non-memory, you see, it teaches us it shouldn't be cultivated for itself. It should be cultivated in conjunction with memory. That is to say, just because you've given up the abiding cycle and looked at the arising and dissolving, that's to substitute one thing for another. You need the whole cycle. The middle phase is conservation of memory. The others are the arising and dissolution of memory. So, for memory to be its highest form, you have to have conservation and dissolution. You need the dance between non-memory and memory. It's like saying the left brain is bad. That's ridiculous. The left brain has a vital function. It's what enables us to communicate and to exist in this world in many ways and to make advances. But it's where we become fixated at one aspect of the dissipative cycle that amnesia sets in, and then a runaway system begins and we go out of control. That's the dynamic of it. So this non-memory we have to learn how to look at it, to oscillate it. And in sitting practice, one of the most valuable things that I have learned from my altered states is the oscillation of memory and non-memory, the oscillation of attention and the release of attention. And realizing, and I always see them in an infinity cycle. I always see them in this form like this. I don't know why. My mind always takes it to this. Just this dance like this, because it moves to like memory, and then and it shifts the dissipative cycle, and it shifts, and it shifts. And this figure 8, actually, that it occurs, 8 is called the lemnis gate in mathematics. And 8 actually is very interesting. This is a footnote. 8 is the number of Isis, the goddess. And 8, the goddess is the great, as it were, the primordial mind. The last thing about objects that I would like to introduce now is that, again, objects in themselves are not negative at all. It is our reference to them that it is this unconscious mental mass, this linguistic flux, invisible flux that makes them what they are or aren't. You see, because there's a tremendous tradition in my research and memory, I was astonished to find, I looked under the folk tales concerned with memory. There is a tremendous array of folk tales concerned with magical objects that restore memory. there is the magical stone, the magical drink, the magical feather, the magical flower, the magical kiss, the magical, footstool. There are things which actually are encoded as awakeners in the environment. And this idea of awakening in the environment is a very interesting one. What it pertains to is the idea of the conscious impregnation of the environment, of mind, specifically to awaken people in future states when they go by or interact with this object. And to use Rupert's framework, this is the setting up of a morphic framework around an object. If you take an object and you sit with it and you meditate it and you sleep with it and you dream with it and you use it in ritual, it begins to absorb. In psychometry, we see that these vibrations are absorbed. Every object we have absorbs some of our field. That's why a psychometrist can take a ring or a belt in a very unusual way. One of the ways this is done for example, in the Gurdjieff tradition, is you take a place or an object, and a good thing that I use in many of the classes that I've taught is you take a doorway and you say to your class or those people that you're dealing with, every time you pass this doorway, you should wake up, be mindful. It's like the bell going off in the retreat, the meditation retreat. Every time you pass the doorway, you have a microsecond of increased awareness that you are part of this universal flux and that you are not just an ego, any way you want to encode it, but a moment of heightened awareness when you pass this object. Then the art becomes to impregnate an environment with conscious objects. And then as you begin to impregnate your environment, you begin to set up an extended mind field in the environment which you react with when you go out into it. And this is why for the American Indian and the Taoists and all the other Aboriginal peoples, that their environment was a conscious environment, that Gaia was alive, and that when you went out, you didn't just see, you remembered. That's what the dream time was about. All these ancestors, the rainbow serpents and the great whales and all the totemic beings, you were reminded that you were part of this dream time, of Gaia, of this living entity. Anyhow, let's stop here. I've got another subject. Let's break for about 10 minutes, but don't wander too far because I want to keep the rhythm, and we'll continue. Part 2, meanwhile back at the source. I want to go on to another subject, a very valuable one that we should look at, and that is one of the counters to the state of kind of waking sleep or this runaway system, this memory wrongly interpreted. One of the principal counters to it is to develop something called cross-state retention. Cross-state retention. I've talked about this before, but I've done a lot of thinking about it kind of since that time. Now, cross-state retention, or CSR, is based on the idea that most of the time when we are in an altered state, whether it's psychomimetically induced or dream or emotional, when we go back to an ordinary state, we don't remember. There's a veil of forgetting between going from state to state. This is, Roland Fisher calls it state-bound experience. In classical memory parlance, it's called state-specific memory. That is to say, if you're, one of the classic things, for example, in Sufi story is Nasruddin, he loses his key and while he's drunk, wakes up the next morning, can't find it, and he says, what am I going to do? And he says, well, I'll get drunk again. And he stumbles off into the bushes again and finds the key because he's in the same state. This is just an example by parable of the way that it works. Now, again, in the dissipative cycle, the abiding section, the center one, there's the arising, abiding, and dissolving. In the abiding cycle, that's where state-specific memory in current research is focused, in this area right here. You don't cross states. You don't look at the transition between arising and abiding, and between abiding and dissolving, and between dissolving and arising. You don't look at the transitions, you see, in contemporary memory research. You only look at this abiding phase and some psychoanalytical history of early childhood. Now, cross-state retention, as most of us know, when we have dreams, unless it is an exceptionally vivid dream. When we wake up, we know that we have dreamed, but the dream disappears like the bubbles of a wave going out after they just go pop, 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 and it dissolves because it's like a different dimension. There are yogas of dream recall taught in the Tibetan tradition. There are yogas taught in African systems of shamanism that I know of for dream recall. There are many aspects of cross-state retention taught in many different esoteric traditions. In fact, I would say that cross-state retention is the essence of all shamanic and esoteric ways of thinking. At heart, for example, Eliade teaches that the shaman is the man who goes into the other realms, or the woman who goes into other realms, but he is able to bring it back. You see, this is what differentiates him from other beings. He's able to bring it back. Many people have altered state experiences and they're, wow, next morning, well, I really can't elaborate on quite what happened, but I know it was fantastic. It's what we call the limbic system flash. You know that it happened and you have a rush, but you can't elaborate it. Now, the idea of cross-state retention, first of all, is never taught to us in school. I want to bring this to a basic, everyday life. We're never taught any idea of cross-state retention. You're taught state-specific regurgitative memory. You are not taught the idea of remembering from one. You're not even taught that you got other states, let alone remembering between them. Now, the idea of this kind of shamanic sense can be taught in many different ways. It can be taught in, for example, the idea of what is called holy reversals is one way in which cross-state retention is taught. For example, in the peyote ceremonies, when the Huichols go to the highlands, is it pronounced Wirikuta? When they go, there's a certain point in distance where everything must be reversed in terms of language and act and symbol. If you are right-handed, you do everything with the left hand. If this is your friend, you refer to him as your enemy. If you're walking along and it's a beautiful sunny day, you'll say, gee, isn't the moon lovely tonight? The reversals are a way of jarring the attention from fixated patterns. And this inculcates an unusual quality to the attention so that it is remembered differently because of the reversal. So this quality of reversal is done in many different traditions throughout the world. That's just one in particular. In fact, I recall one that Rupert told me about once, and that is the tradition of Holi in India. Isn't there a reversal between master and servant?
Yes.
That's rather interesting. And I think this probably arose not from just kind of some sense of equality, but from some sense of awakening. The name itself might have something to do with that. Now, if we look at another aspect of this cross-state retention, to operate it fully, it requires a notion of the entire dissipative cycle, how things arise, how they abide, and how they disappear. And a knowledge also that there is always, no matter what phase you're in, that apparently that primordial mind is there, no matter what phase is showing its face, whether it's the abiding phase or the dissolving or the arising. The primordial sense is always there. And if you have that sense, the idea of cross-state retention is vastly made much more easy. But in practical terms, really, let's get non-theoretical from practical terms, the best way for cross-state retention to work is the following. You see, attention in the modern world, because of all the objects that we've got in it, attention slides across the surface of the mind of objects. It just slides. We never go in deep. It slides across the surface of the world. Now, how do we counter that? Well, for one of the ways in the traditional schools, like in the Gurdjieff tradition, that is done, there's a tradition called self-remembering. And self-remembering literally means that you, just like in mindfulness, you take a moment, any moment, You take this moment, for example, and you make it special by investing it with an inordinate amount of intention. And you see, just in a footnote to this explanation, the sequence goes intention, attention, retention. If your intention, if your will is clear that you want to remember, you will pay attention, and therefore your retention will be clear. Intention, attention, retention. That's how it works. Now, if you want to raise consciousness by this cross-state retention manner, you take a moment, and it can be any moment, and you encode all of your five senses' response to that moment. In other words, you take 1 minute, like right now, you take a minute, and first of all, you look around you, and you don't try to encode everything. This is something I've learned. You look at a number of key objects, 3, 4, 5. The mind can only chunk 7 plus or minus 2 objects at a time. So don't try to chunk, say, more than 5 to 9 objects. You look around, say, at people. You see what they're wearing, just generally. Then you look at your what you're sitting on, and you feel it, and you see what is this texture feeling, like so. And then you do your smell, like I can smell tiger lily over here. And then you can look into the sense of taste, what kind of taste in your mouth, perhaps from breakfast or the coffee that you're just drinking or whatever it is. And what you stop for a moment and you hear the flies, you hear the birds, you hear the sound between, you encode that, and you begin to multi-sensory encode over a 1 minute period. And the way that it works in the phone, you begin to encode all of those things. And the way that it works is, the more things that you can encode a memory in sensorially, the easier it will be to recall the entire memory. That's really it in a nutshell. So, if you're able to have in these 5 sensory modes, it's very different than if you just saw someone, you only have a visual sensory mode to recall from. But you see, the senses reinforce each other. And if you can reinforce them by your attention, you're set. Now, after the 10 years I've been working on my memory thesis, I can put it down to a nutshell what it's all about. Memory is a function of attention. That's it. It's the whole thing. It's the name of the game. If you don't pay attention, you don't remember. It's that simple. It's that simple. And, of course, if you don't have an intention, you don't have an attention. So it's that intention, attention, retention is the memorial cycle. So what we do is we take that minute, and you have to know how to trigger yourself in that moment. I usually, when I give classes or something, do it in a way which is, do you want to say something? Okay. The sense of encoding is done by like a theme. For example, the theme of water is given. I'll say to a class, we're going to meet next Thursday, but next Tuesday, I would like you, or any time before that, any time that you see water in any form, be it rain or washing up liquid or flushing the toilet or taking a bath, any time you see water, I wanted to remind you to take a moment, 1 moment, and stretch it out and do that multisensory sensing. And then I'm going to ask you all to tell your story of that moment. I have them all tell stories and of all these moments. And you get these, and see, what I'm about is slices of life. Every moment is special, but it's only special because of the attention invested in it. And I've had them, these housewives, I taught adult education in England for a while, and these housewives had said, well, I was washing the dishes, and I remembered the water, and I looked around, and there was the full moon, and she just got excited, and then my husband came home, and the dog barked, and this little old moment became special. And many people did this. We did this with all kinds of things. All I'm saying is that this cross-state retention is developed by multi-sensorial attention within, say, a minute's framework. And you have to be able to trigger yourself. The point is, we're too lazy. We walk through the world, and we go like this, but we never just go like that. That is to say, you're walking by a beautiful flower. I do this all the time. And all of a sudden, it catches my attention, and I'll sit with it. I'll smell it, and I'll see the ground that is coming out. I'll let that be a cue. Anything can be a cue for you, and you go into that mode. Now, one of the other things about cross-state retention that I'd like to say, and this really relates to the theme of the extended mind is the idea, first of all, just the idea of cross-state. It involves extension right in itself, right to begin with. The idea, there are two types of cross-state retention that I'd like to look at. And one of them is, it's purely associative, like this idea reminds me of this idea reminds me of this idea, and it's this kind of glass bead game type of thinking, okay? And that is one type of cross-state retention, goes autocatalytic after all. It begins to breed more and more insights. And it's like the opposite of memory wrongly interpreted. It's like memory rightly interpreted when it goes cross-state. Now, the other aspect of it is a Greek term called anamnesis. Anamnesis, anamnesis, or any way you want to pronounce it. But anyhow, what anamnesis has, again, two meanings to it. In the classical Greek sense, it means to be able to remember your karmic trajectory, as it were, your past lives back, like Pythagoras could remember when he was a butcher and a candlestick maker and a this and a that. Pythagoras was known for his ability to trace his karmic trajectory back, and this is the idea of anamnesis. It is used today in psychoanalysis when talking about the patient's past history. They talk about a patient's kind of psychoanalytic anamnesis. Tell me about your early childhood, that type of thing. But you see, at a certain point, anamnesis, just going back with I was a dishwasher and I was a princess and I was a channeler or whatever, an ice skater, this goes back and back and back. And after a while, see, Buddha's first realization, as it were, his parinirvana beneath a bo tree, when he became enlightened, it began when he started going back in his karmic trajectory. He went back 500 lives. And he was a this, and a king, and a queen, and a this, and a this, and he was cruel, and he was happy, and he was delightful, and he was sad. But what he saw in his great genius was not the fact that he could go back life to life to life to life to life, as it were. What he saw is that every one of these lives was, in a sense, an illusory pearl on the necklace of primordial mind. That is, every one of these lives, although appearing separate, necklace of primordial mind. That is, every one of these lives, although appearing separate, was arising from primordial mind. It was apparently separate life, but in this dream kind vista, it wasn't separate. There was only one life. There was only one mind. There was only this one primordial being, and it put on different clothes from time to time in the apparent world. So this is the way that the idea of a deeper anamnesis is not just to go life to life to life, but to go to source. You see, when people play the past life game, I was a this, I was a that, you were this, very rarely do they go back to source. And that's the root. The final anamnesis is back to source, to emptiness itself, to source, to God, to overself, whatever you want to call it. And this is anamnesis depth, as opposed to, and it's a type of cross-state retention to source, as opposed to associative cross-state retention extended-wise. So you go to depth and you go to breadth. Now these two things will trigger each other off. You see, what constantly goes through my head, I'll look at things in breadth. The mind will go, this relates to this, and this relates to this, and this relates to this. It always happens, funny enough, or many times when I'm walking by a big apartment building in a city or something. You look at a room, a window, an arbitrary window, and you know that somewhere in that apartment a drama is going on, a life drama is going on in that apartment. And you realize in that apartment there's another drama, in this apartment, and every one of it, there's millions of dramas going on. And you speed up the mind 1 billion-fold and to all the dramas that are going on the face of the earth until you go like that, and you put them, then you collapse the wavefront, as it were, into just an instant. And you realize that, yes, they're all going on, but it's all now as well. It's not just the extension, but it's the collapse of the extension into the primordial moment. And it's that oscillation between the extension of this glass bead game type of thinking, and you go on, you see it could go on for forever, in infinity. But you have to go back to its source as well, which stops everything in a moment. And then there's this vast sense of interrelatedness. And these two things have to properly interact with each other in a kind of a mystical framework. If you get stuck just on the proliferation, you'll go crazy. If you get stuck just on the primordial now, you'll kind of, this is what they call dead void heretics in the Zen tradition. You just become, I'm deeply in the void, don't bother me, just leave me alone and let me sit. So you have to be able to go from these two kind of states. And that's that dance, that oscillation, which is really key. Now, other ways in which we tend to miss out on cross-state retention in our 20th century life is the idea of the elimination of rites of passage. Any types of rites of passage from childhood to adolescence, adolescence to manhood. I mean, the vestiges that we have left don't really do the job in our culture. Rites of passage are more seen on what kind of salary you're getting. That this is a big rite of passage. Marriage, on the whole, so many marriages aren't conscious marriages. So many children, I mentioned this to Joe yesterday, so many children that are born maybe are not consciously, looked at as a process of birth. But rite of passage is a way of going from one state to another state. And if you don't have that awareness built into your culture, you lose. You lose the dissipative cycle. You lose the big mind picture at that point. So that is an important thing. Another aspect about cross-state retention is the idea of that transitions, that's why I said reversals, they encourage cross-state retention. The solstices and the equinoxes, for example, are points of temporal transition from balances of night and darkness. And these points of transition are ideal times to plant a seed in the mind to say, remember now, at this axis of time, this nexus of time, really remember what you're all about in the cycle, because every solstice and equinox is a point on the dissipative cycle of the year. And you should use these axis points, these kind of focal points, as points to plant suggestions for integration into the environment, to make the environment conscious, as it were. What we have to become, then, in a sense, is what I would call psychic amphibians. We have to be, an amphibian is an animal or a being that can go from water to land. It's a cross-state animal, you see. So we have to become kind of psychic amphibians, in a sense. And this will really begin to get us into the mode of cross-state retention. Cross-state retention would, if taught in this kind of way, would have a tremendous kind of revolution in education, which I want to mention at the very end here. Now, one last thing on cross-state retention is two. There is the, first of all, the idea of, in Jung's theory of synchronicity. It's very interesting. He says, in synchronicity, we have two types of temporal events. One occurs on a causal chain, sequential chain. This happens, and as a consequence, this happens, and as a consequence, this happens. Primary, secondary, tertiary effects. Then, he says, on the other hand, there may be a kind of meaningful cross-connection. Now, it is from this idea of cross-connection that, incidentally, that he borrowed from Schopenhauer, from an essay called On the Apparent Design and the Fate of the Individual. And an interesting analogy there, Schopenhauer took a world globe model, and he took the meridians of the model to be the causal chains of events. But the parallels, he said, these were the cross connections that happened in life. And this is how Jung built his theory of synchronicity, from this geographical analogy of Schopenhauer's. Now, it's interesting that synchronicity means the simultaneous occurrence of a psychic state, an internal psychic state, and a corresponding external event occurs which kind of mirrors or cross-connects to this state, you see. So in the idea of synchronicity, we get we don't get a temporal density, we get a temporal fluidity begins to occur at this time. And this is where magical thinking is born. This is where all the magical memory systems like Bruno's magical memory system take their heart out. This kind of correspondence between all these symbolic objects and the corresponding psychic states that go with them. Now, the last method in this framework, all aspects of divination. Divination is like throwing the I Ching, reading coffee leaves, throwing coca leaves, reading the oracle bones, looking at clouds, reading the flight of birds. These are all processes of divination. Divination means to become godly or have a godly insight, a godly knowledge into something. Now, the essence of all divination is to connect the unconscious to the conscious. It is a cross-state bridge. That's what it's about. When you divine something, so that you throw a mo in the Tibetan tradition, you throw the cards, you read the tarot, whatever it is. It's a cross-state. You're using these symbols, you're using this as a medium, as it were, to go from the unconscious to the conscious, and to facilitate this kind of cross-state communication. And when I say cross-state, it has the implication of extended communication, or of an extended mind concept, goes with the idea of cross-connection. Now, finally, in this, to bring it down to a literal sense, in the this whole kind of cross paradigm. Incidentally, one of the great general systems theorists, James Miller, a biologist, talks about, he said, there are many people who do systems analysis. That is to say, you take a business and you analyze how it works, every little bit of it. He said, but the much deeper way to operate is what he calls the cross-level hypothesis. When you begin to mix things from different levels, symbolic levels. On a mundane term, what's going on with athletics and aerobics and fitness is rather interesting, because there's a new type of training going on now, and this new type of training is called cross-training. It's called cross-training. There's a lot of people going to triathletes, the Ironman stuff, where you swim and then you run and then you bicycle. And what people are doing, I'm reading from an article, it says, first associated with triathletes who needed to be prepared for running, swimming, and biking, cross-training has been adopted by other athletes and now the general public. Skiers are alternately roller skating, lifting weights, and running before the first snow falls. Runners are swimming and doing low-impact aerobic dancing. And in the same way, beginning exercises are swimming, riding stationary bikes, or taking stretching classes, etc. But what it does is interesting. Cross-training appears to cut down injuries because various muscle groups are strengthened by the different forms of exercise. So you see, I'm making an analogy between physical cross-training and psychic cross-training. You exercise different, as it were, psychic muscles by this kind of cross-state interest. Finally, an obvious way of inducing cross-state memory and perception is to be taught in a way in school or in education, which the very last thing I'll say is going to focus on that. Now, one last subject before the final last subject. This one won't be that long. There is a great thinker that I would like to honor for a moment in the general systems theory framework. It's someone that I knew personally, and I know that Terence knew, and that's Eric Jantsch. And Jantsch was he was a mathematician and a musician and a systems man in every dimension. His works are like, they're kind of like the glass bead game in a certain sense. They roam in so many different arenas. And I talked to him about, my work and thesis and stuff like that on several occasions. And there's a term of his which caught my eye, which I would like to bring to front now, which I have found to be, along with the non-memory concept in my thesis, one of the central things that I'm going to be using. and that is what he calls holistic system memory, HSM, holistic system memory. And essentially, he remarks here, he says, in evolving systems, or systems with history, that is to say, all dissipative systems, each system state depends on the past development of all subsystems. There exists, therefore, a system memory in terms of the entire system. In other words, there is some system memory, no matter what phase you're in of the dissipative cycle, whether it's arising, abiding, or dissolving, there is some holistic system memory which has got all the pieces, no matter which phase you're in. There's something which has got it all. It's the way I can put it. Call it an overmind, if you will, for easy visualization. So this holistic system memory, he goes on to say, each system with history, that is, dissipative system, remembers the total development itself of its whole. In other words, its anamnesis, its karmic trajectory, and is therefore capable of what he calls religio, with its own origin. Now, the word religio is from religion. Religion, it means to reconnect with, really to reconnect with the source, is its original intent. So, a holistic system memory operates by reconnecting to the source of the system. So, with that in mind, I'd like to just look at a very interesting dynamic here. What it means is you start from this, say, this is point A. You start here. Now, by reconnecting to your source, it means you go backwards to your source. That means backwards to your, like Buddha's, the emptiness at the end of all those lives, the source, the primordial mind. You're back to that point. Now, at this point, a curious thing happened, and it happened to Buddha as well. After you go back to source, you get a feed forwards into the future of an unexpected, unanticipated range of insight. But you have to go back to ground zero in order to go forward. It's the old French reculade pour mieux santé. You draw back to leap forward. Now, this model I have found operative in so many different forms, in shamanic ecstasies, in psychoanalysis, in personal insight and creativity. It is this idea of going back to source, this temporary suspension of non-memory, you see, and then there can be a leap forward. But there has to be a prepared mind before you go back to source. Many people just think, oh, I'll be quiet and I'll get creative. First you have to fill the mind with intense creativity in terms of a search. There has to be this intent. Then you have to release totally, and you go back. Now, this idea of holistic system memory incorporates then both the idea of, shall we say, cross-state retention at the beginning, going back to non-memory, and then you get this leap into the unknown, which takes you to some other cross-state insight. But it's a very, I'm doing it very succinctly here because it's a subject which I could take a lot more time with, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of this. It's like in shamanic tradition, it's the idea of a shaman takes a psychedelic, for example, and then goes through a state of dismemberment. The idea of the body is seen to be dismembered by some spirit animal, for example, eaten by a great bear or an eagle or a jaguar or what have you. And then it goes back, as it were, you see, this dismemberment takes you to ground zero. You go back to source, where the allies, the spirits, can take you and remake you. And then they throw you into the future like that, and you fly on the wings of the unknown. And you come back with this gift from the unknown at that point. But you have to go through the dismemberment before the rememberment of the psyche. There is that kind of cycle. And it's interesting that in many of the Greek myths, for example, in one of the Greek myths of the 6th century BC, there was a cave in Greece called Trophonius, the cave of Trophonius. Trophonius was the god of dreams and sleep. But you would go into this cave, and you would first sit on what they call the chair of forgetting, the chair of lethe. And this chair of lethe, as it were, you were given what I reckon to be a psychomimetic mushroom brew. And then you were, after this took effect, then you were placed on another chair called the chair of memory. And after you were wiped clean of from the chair of forgetting of who you were dismembered psychically through the psychedelic, then you sat on this chair of remembering, and the new information came through you. Now, again, this is the same way that the cloud of unknowing works. You have to unknow before you come to God. You have to dismantle all your names, labels, places, categories, and concepts. And only through unknowing can you be filled with a different spirit, the Spirit of God. But you have to release first. Now, this idea of holistic system memory is quite a key one. I really haven't done it justice now, but in a re-education process, and that's the last thing I want to spend a few minutes on, it is where I would put a lot of emphasis. You see, the way that our memory works today, we spend a lot of time exercising rote mnemonics in terms of, like all these memory systems are based on win friends and influence people by this fabulous memory system and all this type of thing. But that's quantitative memory. It has nothing to do with quality of memory. Quality of memory has to do with being able to touch source, being able to touch origin, and then this leap of the unknown out of it. I would like to see in some type of educational situation for children. I'm really talking about, I've taught at university level, and I've taught at adult education level. The area that interests me the most now is at the children level, because I cannot see the sense of going 20 years and then telling a kid, look, you got it all wrong, you're neurotic, we're going to have to send you to a psychoanalyst, and to de-school someone after 20 years. I can't see the sense of it. It's totally counterproductive. If you give someone an education which is cross-state or extended to begin with, that is to say, you were taught a good cross-state analogy is the glass bead game in a sense. You see the relationship of a volcano to a symphony to a star, and you begin to extend the mind through all these different categories. You don't just teach children state specifically. This is mathematics, and this is history, and this is biology, and you never teach how they cross. You never look at the parallels in the analogy of the globe. So this is what I would really emphasize in education. And I would also educate in terms of senses, as I've said before here. I really think you have to take each sense, and you have to teach each sense in detail. You want a master of each sense. You want a master of sight, smell, touch, hearing, sound, etc. All of the senses, a master, for the kids to be taught sequentially by each one of these. And then you teach them after the sequential thing how to integrate all these different masteries of the senses. And then you will get cross-state perception. And when you get cross-state perception, you will get cross-state retention. That's really, in a nutshell, how it works. Now, one of the things in the way that we're kind of exposed to life and consciousness in terms today is every technology, as McLuhan says, and I'll quote him, the main influence of any technology is not exercised consciously through concepts and opinions, but rather unconsciously by altering the sense ratios of patterns of perception. You see, it's not just the technology. The technology alters our sense ratios. And our sense ratios have been pushed so that the visual thing is where it's at. And I have nothing against vision per se, but I'm just saying the sense of all the other senses are secondary to vision, which is 70 to 80% of the way we sense the world. If another opportunity arises, I'll share with you, or I have with many of you before, my interest in the sense of smell, I think is another thing that could be emphasized very strongly. So we have to learn how to get our way out of this, what I call sensory amnesia, which we really have for many of the senses. Now, the idea of, as I said, this kind of cross-state amphibians is a very, very important one. And I think that we have to learn in being cross-state amphibians, and from the altered state experience, one of the biggest things that I've ever learned is, as I was trying to point out last night in my question to Terence, so many people can't bring them back alive. It's just, they know they had the feeling, that limbic flash of emotional, yeah, I got it, aha, rush. But they really don't have the content. And the trick, you see, is the following that I found after my own voyages into these realms, is to learn to pay attention while you are in the state of what is going on to a very precise degree. In other words, to imprint at the moment of recognition a moment which says, aha, this is how it works, I see this goes to move to this, this is important, I will put a beacon in my mind at this point, I will light a bonfire, so that later tomorrow when I wake up, I will see that bonfire in my mind, and that bonfire will remind me of that insight, that beacon. You see, what you're doing, as one teacher, E.J. Gold, one of the workers in the Good Chief workers, said, what you're doing is you're building beachheads in the fourth dimension by this technique. What you're essentially doing is you are learning to imprint your attention, your intention to remember at the moment of recognition. You have to imprint that intention to hold. It isn't enough just to have it. You know, as you said before, it's not enough just to, how did you say, you've got to, you're not just looking, how do you say, you've got to face the thing that's already there, in a sense. It's not just a question of confronting something else. And this idea of imprinting at the moment, because you see these ideas that we have in altered states, I'll put it very graphically, have an extremely short half-life. They go like that, like that, like that, like that. And they're coming all over the place, especially when time becomes liquid. They come at you from omnidirectional. As Terence said, you're dealing with hyperdimensional idea complexes. And the way that if you cannot imprint this will, this intention to recall in the ordinary state, you lose it. Now, the way that my mind works in these states, in this kind of extended runs, my mind works in these kind of bifurcations. One thing reminds me of another thing, reminds me of another, and da-da-da-da-da. But unless I make a moment for recapitulation while I'm in the state, I'll lose it. You have to be able to do that, even for a microsecond, or else you lose it. You see, because what it is attention. You are investing some more attention at that moment into the idea. So attention is the way that you can develop your cross-state retention, is the development of attention. Really develop that sense of attention. Anyhow, for then, and really in summing all this up, for the idea of an extended mind, is this idea of going cross-state is extending. But to do that, you have to learn the simple art of attention, and you have to realize that objects are attention traps if you are unconscious, and they will fixate your attention and trap them. You will be hooked onto what happens to your Mercedes or what happens to your beautiful house if you let yourself go to that extent. Conversely, you shouldn't pay, no attention to them at all. There has to be a balance between paying too much and too little attention. There has to be that kind of sense of right effort of attention. But this idea of an extended paradigm, I think, going over the idea of the object proliferation and the attention and the cross-state retention are different ways that I can see that kind of contribute to this overall idea of an extended mind paradigm. So I'm going to shut up now. And I'd like to, if you have any questions or discussion or something like that, go over some of these things.
The trick that I use is when something happens that I want to remember, I imprint it, as John said. But then 10 minutes later, I tell it to myself again.
Yes.
And 40 minutes after that. You cannot simply mark it in your mind and 24 hours expect to go back to it. You have to hand it from the deeper levels to the slightly less deep levels to the more shallow levels and finally into consciousness. And this doesn't fail. If you do that, you'll get it out.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's called rehearsal.
Yeah.
And it is a way of memory transfer. Yeah, it's a good point.
I was very interested by the way in which the themes two of the themes that are striking me a lot in the course of these discussions are the habit versus novelty.
dichotomy. And morphic resonance is a system of habit formation and habit reinforcement. Terence's novelty wave, running through history, the opposite of it, as novelty increases, one way of looking at what it is that decreases is habit, and as novelty decreases, what increases habit. So one can see the novelty wave as a kind of interplay of habit and novelty. And I thought that you took this, for me anyway, suggested several new aspects of this way of looking at things, because through the loss of short-term memory, which you say precedes many altered states, and which is also surely a characteristic of dreams, it means that you're permanently, as it were, surfing on the advancing novelty wave. So you're, what happened, you keep forgetting what's happened, and any object that's there now in the present can turn into something else, because there's sort of no habitual inertia. And this also is like the kind of Terence's theory of the origin of language that he told us last night, where people sort of babble in a kind of xeno-glossy way, sort of surfing on the breaking wave of novelty the whole time and somehow transmitting that to others. But without the language yet having a whole series of built-up and established habitual meanings and conventions. And it seemed to me that your notion of cross-state retention is really, it's partly building up fields which embrace and it seemed to me implicit in all you were saying, and sometimes explicit. There's a kind of hierarchical field model of these things. So what you call, or what Jens called, holistic systems memory would happen when you have a large-scale field with other subsystems within it, each with their own fields. And that even if individual systems come into being and pass away, the larger field somehow retains a memory of them. And the primordial mind could perhaps be considered the ultimate larger field within which all fields come into being and pass away. So it seemed to me to fit quite well with the sort of habit view, and the proliferation of objects, which give us the ultimate sense of habit, because in a sense the solid state of matter, which is what most of our objects are made out of, iron, metal, originally stone, but then these other things derived from the earth and from rocks, like steel and aluminium and so forth. Solid objects, like rocks from which they're derived, endure for extremely long time. Matter in the solid form is at its most fixed and habitual, less fixed in the liquid form, less still in the gaseous, and as a fluid plasma, there's a total flux the whole time. But in the solid form, in the crystalline form, in other words, it takes on a particularly rigid set of habits. And I think one of the ways that we think about reality depends on what we take as the basic paradigm for reality. And I think there's no doubt that solid objects are the basic paradigm for mechanistic science, because solid matter, the atoms, are considered the ultimate small solid objects. They're impenetrable. I mean, talking about the old-style atoms of atomism, as of course atoms have turned out not to be like this at all, but the way they were thought of was as enduring solid objects. And I think that astronomy had a lot to do with that, because the astronomical model of reality is that the sun and the moon and things endure indefinitely, but when they disappear below the horizon, they haven't vanished. They're enduring in where we can't see them, that these solid objects persist indefinitely. And we live in a world which is conditioned by solid objects persisting for millions of years, far beyond human time spans. So we have the idea of astronomical time, and a kind of solid object paradigm, both of long-term time and of the endurance of objects in this world, which is very different from the biological paradigm of reality, which I suspect is, well, I'm fairly sure is Terence's leading one, and to a large extent my own, which the biological model is that, and the model you brought out, is that things come into being, they stay around, they stay for a while, or develop for a while, and they pass away. This is the biological model. Seeds germinate, plants grow, and they die. Babies are conceived, they grow as embryos, they're born, and people grow up and grow old, and they die. And this is true of all things in the biological realm. They come into being, they pass away. And what we have now is a model of the universe, where a biological model of the universe, an evolutionary universe, where the universe comes into being, the hatching of the cosmic egg, or the Big Bang. It grows and expands, and may, in due course, die, or come to some kind of culmination or transition. But that isn't the model that either astronomy gives us or mechanistic physics, which is based on eternal laws and eternal matter. There isn't this perpetual flux of growing, coming to being and passing away. And if we have a biological model, then that fits with both what you said about memory arising and persisting and falling back into non-memory, and fits into what something Terence said very evocatively last night, was this kind of whole biological psychedelic reality behind the world of dreams, which is behind the world, the physical world, in which all of which things are coming into being and enduring and passing away. And things that come into being repeatedly become increasingly habitual. And things that, if we make an abstraction from the most habitual of things, namely crystals, we arrive at the idea of permanently enduring matter as the basic reality, rather than the coming into being of forms and patterns and their passing away and their recurrence.
Yes, I thought it was very interesting what you said about the proliferation of objects causing the increasing densification of the temporal dimension. It seems to me that, I was saying this to Rupert at the break, that it's almost as though there is a transcendental object at the end of time, and that every object that is created is an effort to approximate the felt presence of the transcendental object, so that either, and I wondered as you spoke if perhaps we haven't passed the apex of the object proliferation phenomenon, perhaps around 1900 or so, and that now there actually are fewer and fewer objects in our lives as computers and things like that become multipurpose objects that combine in themselves or objectify in themselves the ability to be many, many different kinds of objects. And in a kind of millenarian extrapolation of that, I can see objects as part of the historical advance, objects beginning to be fewer and fewer. It's a kind of aesthetic taking hold, with the ultimate result being the presence of only a single object in the world. And that object would be the concrescent and objectified mind of the species, because every object is essentially a trap for mind, and a frozen portion of the mental universe, so that one can, and it fails always because it's only an approximation of the perfect object. But and this, to me, this kind of idea ties in with the notion of the flying saucer. The flying saucer, which haunts time like a ghost, has a curious relationship to an axe head. It is, in fact, probably a manifestation of the same thing, so that we can see that mind is trying to manifest itself wholly and completely, and a notion like the philosopher's stone is a notion, a curious blending of mental and physical qualities, where something behaves like an idea but is made of matter and has the enduring qualities of matter but the transforming qualities of thought. So I guess what I'm saying is I think that we could almost measure our distance from the transcendental object at the end of time by the proliferation of objects in our mutually created world. And so that was very useful, that connection of objects to the density of time, to my own notion of a transcendental object, which is drawing things through time toward us. It can be extrapolated further. I mean, it's not only that all objects are attempts to realize the eminence of the felt object at the end of time, but all messiahs are trying to be the Messiah. Religions are trying to be the religion. It's that what being in history is, it seems to me, is a series of attempts to approximate transcendental objects that are felt to be outside of time. And of course, memory is very important in this.
I think the symbol of the all the fascination. The fascination with crystals seems to me to be a signature of this theme, that we're the crystal as the diamond body, which is the ultimately enduring, ultimately transparent jewel which lures us onwards to supreme order, and matter which once chaotic is in its state of supreme order is ultimately luminous and transparent.
So that would view the current interest in crystals as a kind of symbolic fascination. This is my position.
Yes.
Glad that I didn't say it. Yes, I think you're right. That why the crystals are fascinating is not for any imagined power that they possess, but because they are the embodiment of an ideal, quite obviously.
See, this is what I meant before, and just about, I've got this thing here, John, about impregnating conscious objects in the environment, and crystals would definitely be the primary aspect of a conscious object. You're taught that they can heal and respond to consciousness and stuff like that. So it's a very good specific example of a conscious environment. And I think you're somewhat optimistic to think we passed the apex. I think that we will pass it only to the degree that we go through some kind of very large-scale bifurcation point. There's going to be some radical change. I don't think it's just going to be, okay, everybody, let's get rid of all your objects. Obviously, it's not going to be like that. I think the computer can save a lot of, as you say, multi-purpose work and tasks, but you see, capitalism as it stands now is based on the generation of objects. And that's what I mean. And so and everyone wants to make that buck because you only go around once in life. You see, the point is, once we get rid of that you only go around once in life scenario, then the object proliferation will begin to diminish, because then you'll have a dream time kind of consciousness. And if you can have an electronic dream time, this was something that Andrew's talking about, you can begin to do that by using a computer, type of reality, as it were.
Well, don't you think maybe the hopeful sign is that though we don't necessarily follow it in our daily lives, that the dominant, I believe I can say this, I'm not sure, that the dominant aesthetic in the West is an anti-clutter. We really appreciate vast empty spaces and clean lines and white walls and receding perspectives, where our Victorian grandmothers, like to hang plants in small gloomy rooms with tables covered with tchotchkes and...
I'd agree, but by the same token, I think that a lot of the architecture is actually impoverished today. You look at the same street corner in Paris and 100 years ago and today, and you see what's there, and these clean, streamlined lines don't have the elegance. They don't have the beautiful curvilinear sense that represents the arising and dissolving aspect. I know what you want to say, but I can't go completely the idea that we want to be anti-clutter, because I find the clutter is proliferating itself. I wish I could say that it was going the other way, where the awareness of clutter is here, yes, but I don't find you take a culture like Morocco or American Indian culture, where you have you have a teepee or you have a mosque, or you have beautiful, simple, curvilinear lines and not too many objects. I don't know. I think we've got a ways to go before we reach that aesthetic. How many people here?
Well, yeah. I think the Japanese are rather interesting, because they are the masters of space, the masters of no clutter, and objects for them have always been very few, and each material has been understood in its very essence, and that essence has become the object in all its manifestations. But now they're in this extraordinary role of providing us feeding the West with every kind of electronic object.
And there's always new desires. For instance, I was thinking of like simple things like coffee makers, that it's not a few years ago it was a big innovation to have like a drip coffee, Mr. Coffee kind of thing, but now you have to have an espresso machine, and then you have to have the thing with the steamer, and it's not enough just to have a TV, you have to have a VCR, and then you have to have a special timing device that will catch your show when you're not home and play it back, and you have to have a pasta maker, and on, all these things. It's like, I see that it is proliferating, but I think what you might be talking about is that it's miniaturizing. The technology is getting smaller in a sense, but it's not particularly less objects. And the other thing I thought of when you were saying that was the movie 2001, where that whole theme of the object, actually the tool, is so explicitly stated, where the ape is with the bone hitting the first tool, and he throws it up in the air in ecstasy, and it comes down as the spaceship. And in a sense, HAL 9000 is that ultimate tool, and that's one of the main subplots of that movie, that it does do everything that you want an object to do, that it in some sense does approximate this omnipotent power, but something goes wrong and goes haywire.
Well, the curious thing about these lines of progression as they now surface in the computer industry is that the product which the computer industry is dealing is the self. That's what they're selling. And so aren't you interested in buying into the self? How can you be without it? It's the ultimate product. I mean, they say you will be more powerful. Your memory, your plans, your wishes, your intentions. They have, out of dealing us all kinds of garbage, they have finally centered in on the ultimate product, the thing that everybody wants as much of as they can possibly get their hands on, and they're just packaging it up furiously and getting it out to us. But perhaps we've closed some sort of cycle with the realization that the ultimate product can be the self. Now let's just make that conscious, get money out of the cycle, and suddenly we will turn into a very different kind of civilization.
The other thing I was thinking about in there is Terence, when I visited him, recommended this book called Neuromancer, which basically, to follow that proliferation of objects into a fused whole, what this then posits is a not-too-distant future reality where there's a collective consensual reality called cyberspace. In other words, the computer opens out this consensual hallucinogenic reality that you then enter into. I'm not sure I want to go with that, except that that does become, that is a sense an object, but then that also in a sense becomes a state of consciousness as well. And it's a form of an extended mind that everybody shares in.
Yes, computers then become doorways rather than machines. I don't know how many of you have used the Macintosh operating system, but the genius of this operating system is, let's say you're in a program like Full Paint and you need a pencil. You must go and to this thing called the toolbox and get the pencil and bring it back to the desktop and then use it. And when you're through using the pencil, you put the pencil away. So all these conventions of ordinary three-dimensional space have been written into this operating system. So you need know nothing about computers. The computer has disappeared, and the ordinary set of reflexes, go get, pick up, use, put back, are all operating, and you can see in 20 years what this is going to lead to. It's going to lead to these are walk-in worlds that will be made as much as user-friendly as three-dimensional space. That's the goal, obviously, conceivably.
But it seems to me that object proliferation, I mean, it's a particularly materialized aspect of something that seems to obtain at every realm of reality. Because my experience of psychedelic realms is one of a wild proliferation of forms and shapes and patterns, and a limitless proliferation. And biological evolution shows the same kind of seemingly limitless proliferation in over 1 million species of insects, and tropical rainforests with tens of thousands of plant species in them. I mean, there's just this kind of wild proliferation, which presumably happens when the novelty wave gets loose for a while, as it does again on Monday. And this wild proliferation seems to be part of the very nature of things. And the thing about habit is that at least it has a kind of stabilizing effect on some of these proliferate. I mean, why should one want to bring anything back from a psychedelic experience, or even from the Amazon jungle? And in a sense, when one's got it back, it becomes a kind of object, a herbarium specimen. It has a name. It's sort of, it becomes part of the kind of objectified, materialized world. But one of the things that overwhelms me a lot of the time, it's a kind of feeling that I find hard to put to words, is just the overwhelming variety of objects. The fact one could, if one wished, pay attention to almost anything. When I was in India, I was employed to work on the physiology of pigeon pea plants, which are very much to my taste. They're plant my own size, and I like them very much. And I know them better than any other plant, I think. But in a sense, there's infinite levels. The anatomy of the pigeon pea. I know you can cut open any leaf or stem and look under the microscope and see layers of cells and order within cells. And then there are thousands of varieties of pigeon pea plants. We have them growing in our fields. And there's thousands of different things you could look at in each variety, and thousands of measurements you could make in these experiments. And that's just one plant within a genus which has something like 20 other species, and that's part of a family with thousands of other species within it. It seemed quite arbitrary. I could equally well, if somebody had asked me to, have been working on another plant in the species. There's this kind of arbitrary element to attention. And the same with books. You go into a library and there are thousands and thousands of books, or a bookshop, all on potentially fascinating topics. And why should one read one rather than another? And that seems to be the big problem. If one is going to try and make cross-state retentions, or if one is going to try and bring things back, why that rather than something else? Because we live in this wildly proliferating world.
Well, that's a good question. Why that rather than something else? I think the whole thing hinges on how meaningful it is at the moment to the person. Meaning is in the eye of the beholder. And if something that is hyperdimensional to Terence or myself might be different to anyone else here. But the point is, usually, as you go up the node in these kind of hyperdimensional complexes, the ones up high, those are the ones, when you bring them back, are going to have the most extensive communicable aspect to all people at the most basic level. You see, if you pick from too low a level, you'll only be able to communicate to a super specialist. But you want to get those ideas of ultimate generalization, yet ultimate simplicity and ultimate power. And those are the ones. Those are the rare animals, the rare plants, that when you bring them back, you can say something to a few people, and they don't have to have great training. They'll have the most impact. I think that's what it's about, the highest communicability. Kind of hyperdimensional complexes. The ones up high, those are the ones, when you bring them back, are going to have the most extensive communicable aspect to all people at the most basic level. You see, if you pick from too low a level, you'll only be able to communicate to a super specialist. But you want to get those ideas of ultimate generalization, yet ultimate simplicity and ultimate power. And those are the ones, those are the rare animals, the rare plants, that when you bring them back, you can say something to a few people, and they don't have to have great training. They'll have the most impact. I think that's what it's about, the highest communicability.
Yes. Of course, Terence is on to a rather simple topic in a sense, because if every one of the tropical species of the Amazon took one into a totally different psychedelic realm, it would be a kind of arbitrary quality. There does seem to be a manageably small number of known hallucinogenic plants.
Although not a manageable number of hallucinogenic images.
No. But there's a manageable number of hallucinogenic creodes.
That's true.
And in a sense, anyone who has the DMT experience and the mushroom experience is traversing a path, or at least they're going on they're getting a ticket to a realm. They're checking in to a flight to a realm where others have been before. And
phenomenal on the proliferation of language. For instance, as we go back in time, the tools get simpler and simpler. Throw it, do all these things, but you noticed that it could do some things better than others, and you said, we scrape, therefore we need a scraper. We slash, therefore we need a slasher. And these verbs were translated in their functions became objects.
Okay, it's a good point. What happens in this type of thing is you get the co-evolution of language and objects. In other words, as your objects develop language, your language develops objects, and you get this kind of oscillation between language and objects.
So by developing a hyperdimensional object or language, can we force the development of the other?
I wouldn't say you would force it. It would come.
Yes, but so it is in fact the same enterprise. The evolution of a hyperdimensional language is nothing less than the project to create a hyperdimensional object, and vice versa.
In a sense, I would say so. If you get these incredible, psychedelic vision that you have, and you're able, and you call that a transcendental object, then the idea is you will begin to get a hyperdimensional language to begin to make that communicable, or else it stays at that. That's what I mean by bringing it back. By bringing it back, all I mean is by making it communicable so that it is useful to other people. I don't mean to bring it back and stick it in a zoo and say this is a hyperdimensional object from the Amazon and it's one from Africa. It's got to have functional, useful evolution. It's what I call, it has to have a potential, what I call an evolutionary next message quality to it. It really has to have that quality to it. It's not just object for the sake of object.
But then words which are beheld are much closer to being things than words which are merely heard, because like things, they are seen. So there's a migration toward a single translinguistic, if you will, state where objects and words are suddenly found to be the same thing. And this would be the entry out of history and into a magical dimension where words and things are seen to be the same.
This is it. This is dream time. This is this total participation mystique. This is like in many, for example, the American Indian traditions. They talked about there was a time when men could become animals and animals could become men. And there was one language that was common to all beings. This is the time when this, you can hyperdimensional, translinguistic, whatever you want to call it. There was one language, and you could go from species. The idea of what we have of the Nagual, of a shaman going to one animal, I think was much more common in ancient times. But I think.
So this is the realm of the extended mind.
Yes.
In the extended mind, words and things are two sides of the same coin.
Yes, and at the highest level of it.
Yes.
The very highest level. In the beginning was the Word, yeah? And then everything proceeded from that point. And I think there is. And in magic is based on the idea that you can, by intentional visualization, you can create an object. I mean, I'll just say this as an anecdote. I was once doing a test with biofeedback with this friend of mine, Jeff Blundell, in England, and he had this thing all hooked up to him, and we were sitting around, about 15 of us, and he said, I want you to put this coin under one of the books in front of you in a circular table, and somehow I'll be able to sense when I'm at the place and the lights were gone in this machine, the mind mirror and all of that kind of, and he found it 4 out of 4 times where the coin was when he just went by. And then I said to myself, okay, enough of that. And I said, I don't have the coin, but I'm going to create a virtual object underneath my book. I'm going to visualize the bloody coin. And so I did. I put the coin, and he went by me, and his bells went off, and he says, you've got the coin. I said, no way. And he said, I know you've got the coin. I said, no way. And he said, let's look under the book. And he said, what? And I said, what did you do? I said, I just placed a virtual object under there. And what that was just an illustration of was just magic. Simple. It's not magic. It's just the power of the extended mind. You can just actually place something by intention and attention in the environment that will have that effect.
But it really is magic.
Well, it is. It is in a sense. Yeah. Yeah. Please.
To what degree is science and the scientific paradigm just a creation of this hyper meta space, and that the creation of, let's say, DNA first as a thought system and then as a creation of something that's manipulated, and then its genetic structure, and then we can, given that information, have the ability to hang out in our genetic structure as the metaphor of our extended mind, like you were talking last night, our genetic structure going back and our genetic structure going forward. This is historical access of a group mind phenomena at the scientific base.
So where's the nub of your question?
How does this sort of mirror what the alternative experience that you're talking about in terms of the border crossings around going into, let's say, plant or animal phenomena is entering a kind of world experienced enough yet to know that. The science is, let's say, up on this level of the ladder, and we can start accessing each other genetically across the room, but we just haven't figured out that that's how we're doing it.
Well, what I'd first say is what Terence said before. We've done all that in the past, in our genetic past. We've been able to go into plants and animals and rocks and the entire. That's what what the dream time is all about. The animated Earth. It's not just that the Earth was alive. It's just that we animated it by our interaction with it. It's not just this being, the Earth hanging out. It's what, to really get into it, it's what we call the development of the geopsyche. That's different than the Gaia field, which is the mind and the being of the planet itself. But the geopsyche is the interaction of the collective mind of humanity or of a tribe with the Gaia field. And that's when you begin to get a most interesting kind of hybrid going on. And I think what science has done, at a certain level, science is, as Rupert has said, is and we are really an object-based science. We don't look at so much. We don't look so much at the invisible nature of things in terms of this arising and dissolving kind of dissipative paradigm. And I think that until we get a science which incorporates the object world, you don't want to dismiss that, but as well as to see the kind of the magic, this magical element. In other words, you see, like Fritjof-Capra developed the new physics, or they want to say developed, made it popular, and Rupert the new biology. And what each of these guys has done, as I see it, is add the dimension of mind to a classical scientific discipline. And I, in my own sense, I'm an archaeologist, and what I've tried to do is add the dimension of mind to archaeology. So essentially what we're doing is we're restoring a dimension that was written out of the program, but it was always there in the earliest of times. And as, again, what Rupert says, I mean, I have to, listen to, is the idea, yes, this object proliferation is part of history. It's not a negative thing. There's tremendous diversity. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with object proliferation. I'm just saying that when we become attached to the objects, that our minds become attached to them and create this unconscious kind of mental virus, as it were, and we become fixated at that level. But there are the phases. There's a time for object proliferation, and there's a time for it. You see, in music, for example, there's something I'll never forget of the musician John Cage, who used to play what he called a prepared piano. You take a piano and you stick shoes in it and small alligators and marbles, and you get all these weird sounds when you play the piano. Now, one of the things that he said about it, and this is a general systems principle, he said, in talking about atonal music, that's that kind of Schoenbergian kind of, non-rhythmical stuff, he says, at a certain point, spontaneity begins to neutralize itself. And this is so important in composition and evolution. At a certain point, what may be very good for a time actually becomes detrimental to a system. Cancer, for example, is something which is, you have a spontaneous movement, but then it's out of control. You get positive feedback and you're gone. You have to have these kind of these oscillations of kind of, like Rupert said, of some degree of habit, which is positive habit and positive action, and then you have free flow, and then some habit comes back, There's this oscillation. To me, the biggest lesson I've learned in all of this stuff is the oscillation between form and emptiness. And then to know that they are ultimately the same thing. But you have to understand between memory and non-memory is a dance. And between object and objectlessness is also a kind of a dance. Let me just, before, is there anyone else who hasn't said anything that might want to add anything?
I just wanted to ask, and the novelty wave.
Well,
the evolutionary thrust.
Well, I'll say a little bit, and then Terence can, go on. In a sense, in one, how would you define? I'll get to it right a bit. In like a sentence, how would you define novelty wave so everyone knows what we're talking about?
Following Rupert's formulation, I think I would call it the ebb and flow of the interaction between habit and novelty.
Okay. So in a sense, you see, this is very much the same thing between the ebb and flow between habit and knowledge. There's what I call the oscillation between memory and non-memory. You see, memory is habit-based, it's conservation-based. And non-memory is, and even Saraha says this is where creativity emerges from. So, in a sense, the relationship between intention and the novelty wave, it's a good question, is that, you see, without intention decides the point where you will shift from one state to another, from memory to non-memory. Now, the way I look at this, for example, is in meditation practice, for example, if I'm sitting and you take a tennis ball and you throw it up, and the first bounce, right at the very top of the bounce, there's a point in mathematics, it's dx by dt, the rate of change equals 0. It's just that point right there where it's at the height of the bounce. That, and then it bounces again and a little lower, and it reaches that point again and again and again. Now the point is, each one of those points, when they occur in consciousness, when dx by the rate of change equals 0, is the optimum time to shift gears. That's the time where, if I'm doing a sitting practice and I'm focused into one-pointedness, there's a certain point where one-pointedness becomes difficult to hold. It starts to wander around the edges. So what I've learned to do is, right at that point, I shift into no-pointedness. I give it rein. And there's a certain point where no-pointedness begins to get too diffuse. And at that point, when the ball's again, you go back into the one-pointedness. And you have to learn those points of where that ultimate optimum rate of change is, where to shift, but to go with the shift. Don't do it against it. Say, no, I'm doing a one-pointed sitting, and I'm going to do that, and by God, I'm going to torture myself. I have found for me that's not the way. I'm like this, and when it begins to go, I'll go like that, and then when that weakens, I go like this, and that way, you see, it's the transitions from one state to another actually awaken intention and awaken you. When you go from one state to another, it awakens you. And one last point to this about the intention is that I've said before, the cycle is intention, attention, retention. Actually, behind that intention is another memory. And it is a memory, it's this holistic system memory. It's the one that knows the whole show. In other words, there is something behind that, because to intend something, you say, okay, I want this to really be focused. You have to have an idea, an image of what focused is. And you don't know where you get that from. And you get that from some holistic base, which is even before the intention. Okay, any other points that people want to raise, or just before we go have lunch, or comments or anything?
I just briefly wanted to raise something about names and forms, because we talked about the fact with Terence that to some extent objects and their names are the same. But the interesting thing, and of course in Hindu systems you get this hyphenated word, nama rupa, where the name and the form are somehow equivalent. But the interesting thing is that so many forms don't have names. As you say, when venturing through these realms, one's in the realm of the unspeakable much of the time. Forms without names. And to bring them back, they have to be named. And however many you name, there's millions more that won't be named. And it will pass away perhaps forever. And I think that it just occurred to me, we have very much this as a living reality in the world today with the conservation thing. the Amazon jungle is full of species of insects and plants that have never been named. In other words, they're unknown to science, to use the conventional phrase. When they're named, it's announced in the taxonomic journals as a new species to science. In other words, they're not known until they're named. And what's exercising a lot of people at the moment is that a lot of these species are going to become extinct before they're known. And a lot of people think it's not so bad if they become extinct after they've been known. So you send in a collecting trip, and so you can name them all and have them all in Kew herbarium, pressed on sheets and somehow recorded and photographed. And then at least you've done that, even if they become extinct. But somehow the idea that they could just pass away without being named is an actual reality of the world at the moment. This is not just in the psychedelic realms, but there are lots of unspeakable plants, in the sense unnameable plants at the moment, because nobody's been there to name them yet. So although in a sense some things become part of our mental world through being names and forms, the psychedelic experience and the Amazonian jungle and lots of other things show us that there are many forms without names. Clouds are another example. We don't even bother to look at most of them because they have forms. They sometimes remind us of things, but usually we just assume these are unnameable forms.
This is, but it's, as I say, in this model, everything arises out of this emptiness, primordial mind, is infinitely spewing out new names and forms, and I don't think you can ever, you say millions of them, you may never be lost forever. I don't think they're lost forever. Anytime you tap that dream time, that primordial mind, nothing ever truly ever disappears from that realm. It's there, it's contactable by the state that you put yourself into to access it.
Except that it's so vast that you can never be sure that you'll pass precisely that place.
But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. All you can really say is that if you were given the opportunity to, as it were, to imprint and bring it back, and it didn't come back with you, it wasn't right for it. I mean, it didn't have its communicability was not for that purpose. I really wouldn't, I wouldn't worry about that element. Where that came from.
Well, but I think artists are the people who do worry about that, who keep trying to go into it and bring out as much as they can and feel the tension. They want to speak the unspeakable. They want to sculpt the unsculptable, paint the unpaintable. And every time they succeed, a step forward is taken.
It is, but just to round things kind of finally off, it's like what we were just saying the other day about tribal art and canonical art, like the Tonkas and things like that. You see, for them, everything was accessible through a certain canons and frames of reference and geometry and form, because it would awaken within you the new states. What we're saying on this other level, the artist stuff, it is this pursuit of a novelty wave, like if I don't get it, it's gone forever. And it's very different from the traditional ways of canonical art, being able to arise in the mind something. And in surrealism, when it arose in the early part of this century, the surrealist artists and painters and poets, what they were all into, when they started getting and smoking hash and hanging out in cafes and absinthe and all of that kind of stuff, what they really got into was the idea that we can pull out images that no one has ever gotten before, and the Dalis and all those kind of people, Magritte, etc. But what, after a couple of years, I did a study of this, what they found disappointed them profoundly, because the further they went out into the unknown to get back the unsculptable and the unpaintable, they found that archetypes of patterns were coming up that as far as they went to become individualized, they kept on hitting archetypes as far as they went. And that's what, see, all these artists who want to be individual, the unpaintable and sculptable, they'll come up against this.
Surely the whole point is that with habit you have novelty, and yet the extreme of novelty is habit.
In a sense, and what you want to do, though, as we said before, is to have a balance between the best of habit and the best of novelty. That's what the novelty wave, this ebb and flow of the two, and between memory and non-memory. You need that, the yin and the yang, to continually redefine each other, to keep each other, to awaken each other.
Yes, well, or the role of ego, intention, as opposed to the novelty wave. And it seems to me it's a situation like the old saying in Protestant hermeneutics, man proposes, God disposes. Intentionality is the act of proposing. The novelty wave disposes of the intention in whatever way that it can at that moment.
And that's it. This is KPFK Los Angeles, and we've heard the end of John Steele speaking on memory, a discussion with Terence McKenna, Rupert Sheldrake, and Jill Peirce, who is Mrs. Rupert Sheldrake. I should say Jill Peirce and Rupert Sheldrake, who is Mr. Jill Peirce.
The oligarch's nightmare is that we will not allow ourselves to be divided up by race, religion, sexual orientation, or country of origin, and will together have the courage to take them on.